Hello. So in this video, we're going to talk about Lisa Mangini's poetry chapbook, Immanuel Kant versus God. So first off, these are erasure poems, which was kind of a new genre for me. Like, I knew of erasure poems, but I hadn't encountered them in quite a long time. So it was kind of a cool refresher to go back to these. So basically, what an erasure poem is a poem where you find an existing text and you erase most of the words from it, leaving only a few select words, and you create your new poem out of that. So these come from, let me find it here, Immanuel Kant. I can turn the page. Universal Natural History and Theory of the Heavens. So basically what Mangini has done here is taken sections of the universal natural history and theory of the heavens and removed language from it to create these new poems that explore new ideas. And the book is set up kind of being implicitly spoken from two different perspectives. One perspective in the first half being Kant himself, and the second perspective in the second half being God. And what's cool about that is that the first half and the second half have very different sort of central concerns, central ideas to them. There are different sets of things that each of these poet personas is worrying about in a sort of grand cosmic scale. So, but the poems are also nicely paired. There's the same number of poems in each half. Altogether, there are 10 poems in each half, and they don't exactly align per se, but there's a good synchronicity between the two halves. So I'm going to read you a couple of the poems from first the Kant side and then a couple of poems from the God side. We'll talk about each of these. So I like poem 5 and 7 on the Kant side. So those are the two I'm going to read to you from there. And then 4 and 6 from God. They all just have Roman numeral titles. They don't have titles as such in a text or in a words-based sense. So this is poem 5 in the Immanuel Kant side. I find this first self primordial, beautiful. There is a God for only the honest people who test it, or at least the sincerity of doubt. I'm sure people will not deprive me of critics. And then 7 is, I arrange the cosmic merely by shock. They honor my ideas through their judgment. I'm just a common dream, a sour pleasure. I dare to undertake crooked diversions and impassable obstacles. I have rejected the world, equally certain, equally primal, no clarity, only disputes. So what we see in these two poems and kind of throughout the Kant side is this concern with knowing. How do we know something? In particular, how do we know something unknowable, like the existence of God, the nature of God, these kinds of things? But this fundamental quest for knowledge. So this idea in poem 5, for instance, there is a God for only the honest people who test it. This idea. Or from 7, they honor my ideas through their judgment. So the sort of question of investigation and how do we make meaning in the world? How do we learn things and find truth? Are really central concerns with this first half. And then as we move to the second half, where we have the God poems, poem 4, the first one I'm going to read to you goes like this. First, the world, heaviness of attraction. I assume certain consequences which force me to be a fool, false abyss, a mechanical accident. We come together to run into each other, blind and irrational. And then poem 6. Arrange me in the form of shapes beyond the law, ground me in the world, scatter me throughout your design, the entire extent of the smallest material stuff, uniform me in the impulse of all selves, slow me to an equilibrium with their elements, free me from eccentricity. So in both of these poems, I think we have an interesting take on God, because this is a God who, in my reading at least, is struggling not to convey to people the truth of his existence, but this is a God who is struggling with being misunderstood, right? This is a character that has been identified by people in certain ways, and those identifications are not necessarily the identifications that God would choose for himself. So when poem 4 says, for instance, I assume certain consequences which force me to be a fool, a false abyss, a mechanical accident. This is a kind of interesting one, because during the era where Kant was thinking, writing, working, etc., there was this sort of emerging idea of God as the divine watchmaker. This idea that, and this is what the deists, which is kind of the category that someone like Thomas Jefferson falls into, famously among Americans. This idea that God is a sort of universal watchmaker who sets everything in motion at the beginning of existence, the universe, whatever it is, and then stuff just occurs. So this idea of God as a mechanical accident, this idea of God as a false abyss, is sort of rooted maybe in this idea that God is some kind of bizarre, unknowable thing, some entity beyond even the bounds of conceptualization, which is what we get to a certain extent, at least in the philosophy of René Descartes. He makes the argument for God essentially on the basis that because God doesn't resemble anything that exists, in order for the human mind to even have come up with the idea of God, there must be a God that exists. So this idea of a false abyss. But then there's also the idea of God as a fool is an interesting one. And I don't know that there's a specific, or that there's a particularly clear link for that. But, I mean, if we think about the mechanical accident, the false abyss, these ideas of like a God who is unable to make clear to human beings what it is, what he is, what his nature is. There is something foolish about that. Not necessarily in the sense of like, this person is a clown, but in the sense of a sort of failure to, an inability to achieve one's goals. And we get the same kind of issues, I think, in poem 6, where we start with, arrange me in the form of shapes beyond the law. So this idea of like God being constructed by human thought. I think this is really central to who the character is in this. So we have this interesting dichotomy in the book between Immanuel Kant, who as a poet persona, as a speaker of these poems, is interested in knowledge, in learning, in discovery, in finding the truth. And then God, on the other side, who is concerned not about knowing, but about the failures of knowing, the ways in which knowing is limited or unable to grasp the truth. Now, the other thing that's really cool about this book is that it actually does kind of function as an objet d'art in its own right, because of the way the book is actually physically printed. So normally, right, with a book, English language book, you have the front cover, you open it, flip pages right to left, see? But with this book, you have the first half, the Immanuel Kant half, then you have the second half, the God half, which opens the same direction. You flip pages again right to left, but it's backwards from the perspective of the Kant side. So what you have is this setup. If this physically helps you, there's the Kant side over here, and then the God side over here, and they're almost, there's an interesting sort of gap between them where we just have this cover with the space imagery, right? We don't have the hand carried over from either side. We just have space. And there's something, I think, wonderfully symbolic about that. The physical book itself with the sort of empty space between the Kant half and the God half reflects the gap between these two speakers.